Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to SLC3's Mid-Year Economic Review. This is one of my favorite programs of the year. My name is Monica Connors. I'm with Ameren, Missouri, Business Development Executive with our Economic Development team. As an owner member of SLC3, I chair the Training and Education Committee and very happy to be here with you today. We're pleased to have Charles Gascon back with us from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Charles is a regional economist and senior coordinator in the research division of the Federal Reserve Bank, and we'll be hearing from him right after the introductory comments. So I'll give a bio on him just in a few minutes. We're again on Zoom today. So please remember that Zoom etiquette. Hopefully you found a quiet place to participate in the program away from any distractions. We want to make sure everybody has a great experience this morning. So please keep yourself on mute. We will have Q&A beginning at about 9:15 and plenty of time for questions. So we just ask that you put your questions in the chat, and Kelly and I will be monitoring those through the program. And of course, if your question is being discussed, you can come off mute and do any follow-up as you see fit. This process will help keep us orderly for the program today. And please note that our virtual programs are recorded. A copy of this program is available after the program for attendees. So quickly reviewing the agenda today, again, Charles will be speaking starting about 8:30 and Q&A until about 9:30, and then Kelly Jackson's going to wrap it up with some closing comments. So SLC3 is a community of design and construction industry professionals with a common interest in the betterment of our region. Our planning committee has identified 4 key pillars for our organization: innovation, continuing education, equity empowerment, and an all-inclusive workforce collaboration. Speaking of continuing education, I'd like to acknowledge our hardworking Training and Education Committee, a group of rock stars. We get together on the first Friday of the month, every month. This program and all training and education programs are planned by our subcommittees. So a special thanks to Shane Jones this month with CDG for chairing this committee and for the entire subcommittee for their efforts on this program. As a reminder, if you have an interest in joining our Training and Education Committee, please reach out to myself or Kelly. Kelly's always available to share information on all the committees with SLC3, and you can learn more on the website. As an additional benefit for your participation, this program has been developed to permit you to qualify for 1.5 professional development hours for professional engineers or 1.5 learning units through the AIA. Documentation was sent to you via email and is on the SLC3 website on the resources page. We also seek your feedback at the conclusion of each program. Please take a couple of minutes to answer a few quick questions that are sent to your inbox about the program. The evaluations and comments are used to prepare for future programming, as well as determine the overall value of our education and networking programs for the year. We do take all evaluations seriously and always hope to improve on our programs. We're proud to say that we received high marks this year throughout the pandemic and our online content. So we appreciate that feedback. The SLC3 is excited to announce our 50th anniversary this year. We've had a packed calendar, and hopefully all of you are marking our events as we go through the year and start to transition back to in-person events. Next week, our emerging leaders are hosting their very first networking event, Cocktails and Conversation. This event is open to everyone and will have a number of activities to enjoy some networking time with your peers in the industry. The event is June 29th and starts at 4 o'clock. It's located in Kirkwood at 612 Kitchen and Cocktails. In July, we will have a virtual technology innovation program on immersive VR. Demonstrations will be included. Please be sure to register for that. And then on August 12th, we're excited to have an in-person program, Design Build 2.0. This will include a panel of owners, designers, and contractors. August 18th is our Best Practices in Diversity Awards Gala at the Hilton Frontenac. The call for entries and nominations are out. Please check the website for more details. Invitations are coming out very soon. So please be sure to get those entries and nominations in. We are packed with events going forward and do plan to host most of the remainder of our events in person. So the SLC3 calendar of events is available on the website. As I said, please make note of those events. Kelly also wanted me to make sure that I mentioned that SLC has a new address. So they've moved to new offices, new digs, and they're very excited to be located now at 301 Sovereign Court, Suite 101 in Baldwin. So please let your companies make them aware of the change for invoicing and whatnot. We've been posting on LinkedIn, and Kelly also wanted me to remind you to follow SLC3 on LinkedIn and repost. Today's a great example to repost this event with some comments and maybe some takeaways that you learned today. And so last but not least, before our program begins, we want to take time to recognize our sponsors, our annual training and education program sponsors. Cosney Wagner is again our annual platinum sponsor. We appreciate their top tier support each year. Our gold sponsors are McGrath and Associates, Ross and Barazzini, Kwame Building Group, and L. Keeley. Our silver sponsors are Farnsworth Group, Kaiser Electric, JF Electric, Hankins Construction Company, Abna Engineering, OWH Architects, Custom Engineering, and Hush Blackwell. Annual sponsorships are truly the best way to support the SLC3's mission of providing excellent continuing education. And now we're ready to start the program. So as an economic developer, I'm thrilled to hear what Charles Gascon has to say today. Charles Gascon is here today to share with us population trends, how the economy has recovered from the pandemic, provide a forecast on jobs, workforce, share what telework means for cities, and strategies for slow growth environments. As a regional economist, he analyzes economic conditions in the 8th Federal Reserve District and reports on conditions to the bank president and staff economist prior to Federal Open Market Committee meetings. He is responsible for writing the bank's Beige Book report on local economic conditions and contributes to other bank publications. His work has been cited in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and in local media outlets. And so without further ado, a little early, Charles Gascon, please take it away.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here and we'll get some slides going. You see my audio is okay?
You're good.
Cool, thanks. Let's get some stuff rearranged here. Okay, that should be good, right, Kelly? You can see that?
I can see it.
Perfect. Okay. So the plan for today is to kind of go through things in a couple different stages, but just before I kick things off, just want to put my disclaimer out there that these are my own views and they're not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or the Federal Reserve System. So don't blame my bosses for anything that I might say here. So what I really want to do today is to kind of break out my talk into 3 chunks, so to speak. And the first is to talk about kind of some of the long-term trends that are affecting the economy that I think we have often lost sight of over the last year, as there's been just so much noise from the business cycle and from the pandemic. But these long-term trends are going to be really important for shaping the kind of the medium-term outlook and ultimately some of the pace of the recovery that we're seeing today. So I'm going to start there, then I'm going to focus primarily on COVID-19, the recession, and then the subsequent recovery that we're currently having, and then looking into the future outlook. So that's the rough outline for my talk for the day. Just to kind of get things going, I think it's important that everyone has an understanding of kind of a framework in which we can kind of think about regional growth and why states or cities are growing at different rates. And in starting kind of at a fundamental level is this idea that all places have different natural features that make them more or less desirable over the long term to people. So some places have coast and nice beaches, some places have good farmland, and some places are very cold, and some places have great accessibility for ports and harbors. And ultimately what that's going to mean is that places that have naturally, more desirable geographies for certain reasons are going to grow faster, and people are going to migrate to those places, and other people are going to move elsewhere. And so what that means from a kind of like a really broad term standpoint is, if you were just randomly to drop people in the country, they would more or less be equally just distributed throughout. But we know when we look at a map of the country, our population doesn't look like that. It clusters in cities, and then there are also rural areas. And what's going on here is that idea that there are certain areas that have distinct features that make them desirable for more people to live in. And what also happens over time then is some of those areas that seem desirable can often get overcrowded. And then due to issues of congestion or crime or pollution or other types of factors, they ultimately end up actually shrinking back down to some type of optimal size. A lot of research that's been done kind of currently suggests that kind of the optimal size for most metropolitan areas to grow at their fastest rate is somewhere around 2 million people, 2.5 million people. Cities that are larger than that tend to be shrinking or growing much more slower. And cities that are smaller than that are finding ways to accelerate. But if you get below 500,000 people in a metropolitan area, they tend to struggle due to the lack of kind of the amenities that you need in a global economy, such as access to international airports or even regional airports for that matter. So that's kind of this sorting that goes on in the country. And I think the easiest way to understand what it looks like in population growth, and some of you have maybe shown this chart too in the past, is if you think about which cities are growing the fastest historically or in the last decade, it's places like Austin, Texas, and Phoenix, Arizona, and Nashville, Tennessee. And the reason that they're growing fast is primarily due to this idea of domestic migration. It's people within our country moving elsewhere. And that's what this dark blue area is on this chart that you're looking at, which is this top corner here of dark blue is all the contribution from domestic migration. So people moving within our country elsewhere. Overall birth rates have slowed. I think that was something that was noted as the 2020 census numbers and American Community Survey numbers were coming out, is birth rates are at their slowest rate that they've been in the last about 50 years. That being said, for the most part, birth rates are relatively uniform across the country. A few exceptions, like places like Tampa and other places in Florida that generally have older populations, their birth rates are much lower. And in the case of Tampa, are actually negative. But this key driver, again, is the domestic migration and people moving around the country. And this is going to be fundamental when we think about the pace of economic recovery in the future. Because we are seeing a slowing birth rate, we're also seeing slower immigration rates, which means that growth for our cities across the broader Midwest is primarily going to be coming potentially at the expense of other cities in this country as people are moving from one place to the next. Moreover, I just kind of making the last point, I mentioned this already, the largest cities in our country, like Miami, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, are on net losing people, and net migration is domestic migration is negative in these cities. If we take it a step further and just look regionally of what's going on, again, what we're seeing is most of the population is moving to the Rocky Mountain areas and to the Southwest. So those are the places where most of this driving is coming, as well as to the Southeast and places or in Georgia and Florida and North Carolina. So again, it's this domestic migration that's really driving this growth. The Plain States has seen a bit inward migration. However, a lot of that is ultimately attributed to what growth we've seen in North Dakota due to fracking, kind of early in this decade. So that's kind of the basic framework that we want to think about. And the reason I bring this up now is there's been many headlines over the last year talking about remote work, and I'll get to that in a bit, and how it's moving businesses and firms out of places like California and congested cities on the coasts. However, these trends were already going on, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that people are already moving out of some of these congested areas into places where the features were more desirable for the economy today. So how do we have a kind of just like a really basic model or framework for thinking about metropolitan growth. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to focus on population growth since 2000. So we're backward looking here. And what I'm going to do is kind of identify what are some of the key factors of growth. So one I mentioned already is how big cities already are. So there's kind of this non-linear function in which if you're in that sweet spot of 1 to 3 million, you tend to be growing faster. Places that are near coasts or rivers or shale basins are growing faster. Climate, such as the number of average days of sunshine you have, is generally an indicator of population growth and faster growing areas. The skill of your workforce, particularly in higher education, and then the industry and occupational mix. So we know that certain industries like manufacturing have been in decline for the last 50 years when it comes to employment. And so that definitely plays a drag in cities that were heavily manufacturing cities in the past. Other pieces I'm going to include into here are going to be public sector indicators, such as the number of governments that are in an area, the number of governments due to segregation, due to kind of fractional groups kind of forming their own communities and then forming their own governments. It tends to create frictions in cities that make it more difficult to have optimal policies. We're also going to include things like tax and spending measures for state and local governments to include for many of those factors that get discussed on a regular basis, although the overall impacts tend to be driven primarily by some of the earlier indicators that I have here. If you put this model together, this is what you get for kind of some of the key cities in this region and St. Louis specifically. So the red dots in the charts are going to show you kind of the predicted population growth based on those indicators that I just mentioned. And it suggests that St. Louis's population should have grown by about 12% over the last 20 years. However, it's grown by about 5%. At the same time, you see places like Nashville, Tennessee, and Denver, where population growth, due to the factors that I mentioned earlier, were expected to grow much faster than a place like St. Louis. In the case of Nashville, actually overperformed, and in the case of Denver, growth has actually underperformed the overall picture. But the broader cities in the Midwest and in our Federal Reserve District that I look at really closely have generally underperformed these expectations. And it's primarily due to factors such as, in the case of St. Louis, kind of an over-reliance on growth in the healthcare sector, in particular, that is been our key anchor in growth. And many of these other sectors have not grown as fast or brought in the jobs in areas that we would have expected them to bring in. So I think that's one thing that's worth noting. And I'm happy to answer more questions about this in Q&A. So if I put it into a line, this is roughly what it looks like. So you would have expected that the metropolitan area should have added about 3 million people today. However, population has really stagnated right around 2015, 2016. And we're still at about 2.8 million in population for the region. If we break this down by some of the key counties, a few things stand out. So first of all, kind of this idea of urban sprawl and the decline of urban centers is more or less predicted by these models. So in the case of the city of St. Louis, expectation in 2000 was that we would see probably a steady population decline. It's been a little bit weaker than expected, but more or less, I'd say consistent with the forecast. In the case of St. Charles, one of the counties that's really boomed in this region, growth has been much faster than expected early on in this period. But as the population in the entire metropolitan area started to slow, which I'll get to in a second where that's coming from, population growth in St. Charles County is more or less converged back to this trend line that was predicted back in 2000. So where are we seeing kind of the biggest shortfalls in growth? And it's really coming from our kind of suburban counties, such as St. Louis County, Madison County, and St. Clair County, where they had all the kind of the key attributes, such as, available land to develop and quality housing stock, educated workforces. And we're expected as most suburban areas like St. Charles County were in other suburban counties around the country were expected to grow much faster. And in fact, all three of these counties experienced population declines at some point during the last decade. So this is where we're seeing this unexpected population loss, which is in the loss of some of these suburban counties in particular. Okay, so just a few key takeaways before I turn to the outlook. For one, St. Louis area was expected to grow slowly. 12% still below the national average, but it's underperformed those expectations. Faster than expected domestic migration in the suburban areas. So people moving out of our suburbs and moving to other metropolitan areas was kind of the key driver to this slow growth. And I think most importantly, what we'll get to in a second here is that COVID accelerated many of the trends that were already occurring. So as I get into the outlook, I think it's very important that we think about how we should be moving forward, not necessarily trying to move back to the pre-pandemic economy. The outlook, as I'll mention here in a second, is probably for continued stagnant population growth. But this can be sustainable for some time. And I'm going to skip the last 2 points because I intended to delete them at this point, but I'm going to come back to them in a second. So turning to the outlook, I'm going to go through the last year in just one slide because I could spend an hour on it if we really wanted to get in depth here. But I think everybody's lived through it and we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on it. But January was good times. February and April is what I would consider kind of the initial pandemic shock. So this is the period of time where we had a health crisis and a lockdown. We had a financial crisis. The economy was in downfall. Federal aid, particularly from the CARES Act and then special lending programs from the Federal Reserve, really kind of stabilized the economy. However, it really wasn't until April to October that the economy started to recover, although the health crisis continued to worsen. So kind of knowledge of the pandemic and testing really brought this stark divergence between the trends that we were seeing with the virus and economic trends. I think when we end up looking back at this period in time, the recession itself will be contained to kind of this February to April period. And beyond April, the economy in many ways has been in an economic recovery. November to December, we did see this recovery slow. Some of this was cited as election uncertainty. Federal support from the CARES Act also ran out. And the economy, as we mentioned, that aid was really propping up many sectors of the economy, so that slowed things down. And then we heard from many of our contacts that with vaccinations on the horizon, many people just postponed and many businesses postponed their plans until they had a clear sense of the outlook. And that uncertainty overall just pushed activity that maybe would have occurred in 2020 into early 2021. So now where do we find ourselves? I think what we do is we find ourselves in an economy that's much stronger than we expected back in December and continues to improve at a faster rate. So what I have here is a chart of real gross domestic product for the US and the projections from the Federal Open Market Committee. And my lights just turned off here, so give me a second. Back in December of 2020, the committee expected growth in 2021 to be about 4.2%. With the numbers that were just released earlier this week, or I guess last week, the committee reported kind of a consensus that the economy would grow at 7% in 2021, which would be the fastest growth on record since probably going back until the 1970s. It'll be probably one of the fastest growing countries in the world in 2021 as the US economy rebounds. This faster than expected recovery has led to a lot of problems, as I know many of you in your sector are facing when it comes to construction materials and supply chain disruptions. And that is leading to probably some of the fastest price growth that we've seen in many sectors of the economy in quite some time. So again, the consensus was that we'd have kind of a relatively fast growth in 2021. And now we're seeing that this growth is even faster, and it is leading to kind of a temporary surge in inflation pressures, and expected that we're going to have probably inflation rate around 3.4% by the end of 2021. So this is down from about 5% where we're at right now. The key drivers of inflation that we're seeing right now are primarily coming from areas like used autos, where there's just shortages of inventories. And it's ultimately coming from the fact that there's fewer new cars to sell due to semiconductor shortages that are taking place in that area. But we are also seeing many commodity prices go up, such as in areas such as plastics and lumber, until more recently lumber's come back a bit. But these are kind of really key challenges that we're facing as the economy has been able to open up a lot faster than the supply has been able to come back. And I'm going to talk about kind of what's driving some of that supply, the supply shortages, and why it may persist a bit longer than we may expect here. From a monetary policy standpoint, at the June meeting, policymakers noted that with the stronger economy and a quicker rebound than expected, that it is more likely that we will find ourselves in a place where we're able to lift off from the zero lower bound, and by kind of 2023 we'll have interest rates still well below historical norms, but probably above zero, and close to about 0.5% is roughly the consensus on that. And again, this isn't driven by time as much as it's driven by just a stronger rebound in the economy, and risks more tilted toward the upside as the downside risks have mitigated. So if I kind of put a couple pictures to you for how I'm thinking about the economy right now, one is that unemployment rate's down to 4.7%. This in many ways is an understatement of what the labor supply looks like, as we have seen a lot of people drop out of the labor force and are yet to return. But in a weird way, we're facing a labor market that's as tight as it was before the pandemic. And total GDP growth is probably back at, or total GDP and output for the economy is probably back at a level that it was before the pandemic, with many fewer workers in the workforce. On top of that, we have disposable income that's up from 2020 February. It's up about 9% due to aid coming from the federal government to get us through this pandemic. So that's going to leave some fuel for growth as municipal governments have money that they're looking to spend. Households are seeing record high savings rates, and combined, that's creating a very strong economy. Now, the one problem that I think is facing many areas is this idea that we still have this huge jobs shortfall. So, but if you think about the 2008-2009 recession, after about 2 years, we had lost about 81,000 jobs. And it took us roughly, 15 years to recover all those jobs. During this pandemic, we lost about 140,000 jobs. We saw a quick recovery, but even so, we're still down about 74,000 jobs from the peak. So we have an unemployment rate that's very low. We have demand that's there. Ultimately, there's a desire to try to get as many people back into the labor force and working as possible in order to meet the demand that's out there. And that's proving to be very difficult right now, as many workers are still on the sidelines. So what I want to do next is take this 74,000 jobs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down to explain to you kind of where these 74,000 potential workers are currently residing. And what we see is that the current shortfall of 74,000 workers, about 55,000 of them, I would say, remain kind of in the supply of labor. 24,000 of them are still unemployed, so they would be reported in the unemployment rate. 13% are unemployed, but on temporary layoff still, so they have some indication that their employer thinks they're going to call them back to work. So they may not be looking for work at this point in time. 18,000 people are not in the labor force, so they're not actively looking for work. But they have said that, if a job became available and interested them, they would take it. So these are very difficult people to hire because they're not looking. But eventually we'll start to see these people move back into the labor force. And then ultimately we end up with about 19,000 people or a quarter of those that are in this current shortfall that are just not in the labor force and not looking for work. So these are likely people who retired early or have decided to pursue continuing education as a result of the pandemic or for other reasons. They're just making a career choice. And so ultimately, trying to get 74,000 jobs back from where you really only have 3/4 of those in the supply of the labor force is going to be very difficult. And that's part of the reasons that some of the prints on the national employment numbers over the last couple of months have probably been a bit lower than many expected, is that we just have these very tight constraints on the supply of the workforce. That's spilling over into the supply chain difficulties that we're seeing in manufacturing, as well as in many other sectors of the economy. So turning to the outlook, there is an expectation that probably by 2022, mid 2022, the St. Louis economy should fully recover all of the jobs that it's lost. However, as I mentioned earlier, and this is where these demographics and migration trends come into play, the outlook beyond that point is for more or less flat employment growth, as we don't have any kind of clear sense of where the labor force growth is going to be coming from. And again, most of the growth that we are seeing in employment is coming from kind of some of the outlying suburban areas, with St. Louis County, St. Charles County being the key drivers of job growth in the region. These are coming from an outside forecasting firm, so just to kind of keep that in mind, that these are really headline numbers based on a model, not necessarily a look at what's going on the ground to determine these numbers. And again, slow labor force growth is really one of the keys that we have to look at here. So we're expecting the population, the prime age population, 25 to 54, to decline just slightly. Those are the people that we would think about as most likely to work. In the state of Missouri overall, we're also expecting that growth rate to be below the national average. So this continues to present a constraint in trying to find ways to grow the labor force and get more people employed in the region. And this chart I've been using a lot lately, and I think it's very important as we get more or less into the later part of this year and into early next year, which is we can't lose sight of the trend, the long-term trends that are occurring in the region as we see the economy start to rebound. I think there'll be a sense that as things get better over the course of the year, as the pandemic subsides and jobs start coming back, that we're on the right track. And there's definitely will be clear indications that we're on the right track. But what I want you to note in this figure is the US employment and St. Louis's employment saw a stark divergence. And in a weird way, total employment in the US, even after the pandemic and where it is today, is still higher than the peak relative to 2009 than it was in St. Louis. So they saw a pandemic drop off, but it's really what happens over the next 15 years that's going to shape the economy. So I think there's a strong desire to try to reopen as fast as possible and go back to the way things used to be. And I just urge caution and thinking about where we need to make investments in order to kind of turn some of these longer term trends around. Because absent turning those trends around, we'll continue to see this divergence happening. Okay, so I want to take a sidebar, and then I'm going to wrap up here, and we can talk about some questions. And it's thinking about teleworking, because this is something that's really starting to be at the forefront of many institutions' minds as we go back into work. And what does it mean for cities and growth in the future? And one of the things I think it's worth noting is there's this narrative out in the public that urban areas and city centers experienced a huge decline due to the pandemic. And it was due to people leaving the cities and moving and buying houses in the suburbs. And this is kind of the story here. However, when you look at the data, what you actually see is it is true that urban areas have seen a decline in their relative population. but it's not due to urban flight. It's actually due to just a drop in the number of people that are moving into the city. So there's always people moving out of city centers into the suburbs, but they tend to get backfilled with new people that are moving in that want to take advantage of the amenities that the city has to offer. Would expect this to return as the pandemic subsides, and people can enjoy all the amenities that city centers have to offer. So I don't think that we have to use a little caution when we think about kind of what it means for the cities themselves. I think there's a lot of reasons to think that city centers will come back. However, that being said, most surveys and research are finding that many more work days will be provided from home, up probably about a quarter, up from about 5% pre-pandemic. It's worth noting here, who are these remote workers? They're most likely going to be high-skilled professional occupations and people that are in high-income households. So again, this is what's driving this narrative of booming housing prices in suburban areas, which is those that are most likely to be able to work remotely are going to be people who have higher incomes and high-skilled work, and they may be looking for housing in more space. However, it's still going to be about 3/4 of workers that are going to be working on site at their businesses. What economic models are finding is a couple of things. And I like kind of using a little bit of history when we think about this stuff before I get into some of the findings, which is in a lot of ways you can think about remote work as being the same as advances in transportation technology or the expansion of our highway system over the last 100 years, and that it reduces our commute times. And that's ultimately what's driving a lot of these actions. So what economic models, when we think about remote work, what they're finding is that jobs actually end up moving to cores of cities because they're in general proximity to more workers. And then residents are generally moving out to the suburbs. And because you don't have to commute as often, you don't mind a longer commute. However, there's also a shift then in property values, and that residential areas don't value having office space or industrial space is in the close proximity, and they'd rather have parks and other types of amenities in their areas. So as a result of that, there's a push to move businesses in particular to the cores of cities where they have a kind of a broader pool of workers. What it also means is that housing prices near the city center, or particularly in those nearby suburbs to the city, would actually grow more slowly, while suburban housing prices will grow much more faster. So you'll see a kind of a flattening of this housing price dynamic, where normally if you would go further and further out from a city center, housing prices would drop off very sharply. Now it's probably going to be a flattening of that housing profile over time. What is disappointing, though, I think, is that the impact on congestion remains really unclear. You will see people commuting fewer times per week, so that can reduce some commute travel. However, the number of miles commuted may not change because people will commute longer distances, and also just maybe make those trips less frequently. And then because they're living in less densely populated places, you'll actually see non-work commuting increase. So instead of being able to walk out of the office to go grab a cup of coffee, people will be driving from their homes during lunchtime and other points in time to meet with coworkers. And so you could actually see travel overall actually increase as we see a reduction in density. So it's not necessarily going to lead to all of the desirable outcomes that we're looking for. As it comes to this domestic migration component, there's also a lot of incentives then for large cities that already have major benefits and a lot of amenities could potentially expand further and have even increasing sprawl as a way to kind of mitigate some of the housing price issues that you see in a place like New York or San Francisco. So where does that leave us right now? I think, first of all, it's important that we continue to keep an eye on population growth. Population growth remains a key sign of regional economic prosperity. And I mentioned it's geographic prosperity here because you kind of have a stable population with rising incomes and rising employment rates and property values, and that can represent a prosperity increasing for our current population. But if you have these things, if you have a set of people living in a community where their incomes and employment rates are going up and their property values are going up, ultimately that's going to lead to more people wanting to move into these areas, and sets this idea that you want prosperity and that you're having a prosperous region and growth in the future. Making these investments in the local population and entrepreneurship in particular are great ways to grow the labor force, overall income and demand in a manner that's sustainable. One of the challenges that you face as a community in trying to bring in things from the outside is it increases our demand for public services for more people. So trying to invest in the local population is really key here, as turning those numbers on migration can be very difficult. As I mentioned, I think there's some concern that remote work is gonna kill urban centers. However, I think increasing the job and business density ultimately improves access to jobs for many people, particularly those that need to work on site. So developing out in remote areas for those that are in the higher income group that want to work remote, that comes at a cost to those that have to actually be on site. So increasing this job and business density can still improve access to jobs and generate productivity gains. Focusing on economic equity and inclusive growth is essential in this environment, particularly because we do not have increases in immigration. We have declining birth rates. We have an aging population. So our labor force is ultimately shrinking. The only way to continue to produce the levels of output that we have are to expand our labor force. And one of the key ways to expand this labor force is finding those people that are disconnected from it or potentially disconnected from it, and getting them connected to the labor force. It'll ultimately benefit them, but it'll also benefit the aggregate macroeconomy. Telework is creating this disconnect between the locations of jobs and households, particularly for upper income workers. And so what that means is attracting businesses to stimulate migration is not necessarily going to work as well as it has in the past, if it worked well in the past at all before. But it's likely to place an existing burden on populations regardless of the outcome that we have. And this renewed focus on households and understanding the household decision-making process is something that's often overlooked in economic development, and it's left for areas of community development. However, we do find ourselves now in an area where we really need to focus on the household, understanding what are the features that households are looking for, what is the housing stock that households need, and how do we upskill our workforce, and then the businesses will come and the jobs will come absent that. And if you have high skilled workers, then they can work anywhere, providing them with the right amenities in this region is key to retaining that population. And then I would just end with this, which is if we go out the next 20 years and we think about where we're going to be at for the 2040 census, the prime age workers for that 2040 census are between the ages of 5 and 34. So training our youth, developing our school systems in a way that have them prepared for jobs of the future, that jobs that don't exist today, and then also retaining those that are young, that maybe are leaving for college, and finding ways to attach them to the labor force so they don't feel like they have to look elsewhere for job opportunities. This is really the key. And so it's looking younger than where we maybe are thinking about when we think about these areas of the economy, because this group is not a key contributor to the economy today, but they will be the key contributor to the economy over the next 20 years. So really thinking about what we need to do for that group of the population so they want to stay here in the St. Louis region is essential for growth over the next 20 years and ultimately turning that curve in migration. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Great, thanks, Charles. We do have a couple of questions here. The first one coming from Kevin Sullivan. He heard a sound clip from Michael Nydorf at Centene in Charlotte, North Carolina, touting the access to a high-quality workforce, which will be needed for the growth that Centene plans to have. Can you compare the access to a well-educated workforce in St. Louis versus Charlotte?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it gets to that last data point that I was mentioning. Is we do see a gap right now in the workforce quality and the share of workers that are trained and ready to go. On the margin, it's relatively small, so it exists, but it's one of many decision-making factors. I think the piece that ultimately is driving these comments goes back to my earlier point about migration, which is you're seeing faster growth in that quality of the workforce than you're seeing in the St. Louis area. So while the kind of the educational attainment numbers and like the skill level numbers that you see today are probably very comparable, you're seeing faster growth in some of these markets due to migration. And so it's easier to attract people to those regions. And again, that gets to the point that I want to make at the end, which is thinking about households and what we need to do to attract and retain those younger workers is really key to kind of growing that pool of workers into the future. So today, things look very comparable. It's going out the next 10 years that we have to really stop and think about. But I also am always hesitant to think about the skills of the workforce between the ages of 30 and 55, because business investment decisions are long-lived. So we really want to think about what's happening kind of in the 20 to 40, maybe even younger than that group, because that's really the key to kind of future business decisions.
Great, thank you. A great segue to our next question, which a few folks I think have regarding our geotech sector and NGA. So maybe just touch on it seems like a huge opportunity for St. Louis, right? We've been talking about it for a couple of years now that they've announced their big investment here. How do you have you done any studies to see how that will impact St. Louis City and the region?
Yeah, I haven't. I mean, there's a lot of economic impact studies that are out there. I think it's difficult to know what the counterfactual would look like in order to truly understand what the economic impact is. And what I mean is we don't know what the land would be used for elsewhere. Moreover, going back to this concept of migration, if you add these new jobs and these companies that are associated with it, but we're not able to expand the labor force, the economic impact could be that you end up seeing people switching from one to these new jobs, and then positions are left vacant. And maybe those positions are automated away and we end up with the same outcome that we have today. So it's a huge opportunity, and it creates new job opportunities for people to move up this job ladder that we can think about. The way that you end up with the biggest gains is ultimately if you again can take those people that are disconnected from the labor force or potentially disconnected or potentially moving elsewhere and retaining them into these new jobs that are opening up. That pipeline and building that process out is something that I think is currently being developed in the region, but that's what's really essential for turning this into the impact that we want to see, which is that you need to ultimately be able to move new people into employment as a result of this. And some of the issues there are structural in nature, from childcare to access to even the locations of where some of the jobs that may be opening up are. So childcare and transportation issues need to be resolved for these things to play out in the key way that we want to think about it happening.
Great. I might touch on that after we have a couple more coming in. If we've lost 26% of the labor force, what is the projection on wage growth or the impact on wages to bring those folks on the bench back into active employment? So
So wage growth is definitely accelerating. I don't think that many of that 25% they're just going into retirement. So, I mean, it would take a lot of wages or potentially changes to the workforce requirements and the work requirements that would bring them back into the labor force. So we are seeing a lot of wage growth, but I think the other piece to this that we're going to be seeing, particularly for those that have dropped out, is actually changing in work environments. So some might be remote work, but some of it also might be just changing work schedules or changing the structure of work so that maybe you have more part-time employees that work as a team so that people that are to the point where they're in early retirement have the flexibility that they want, but you can still kind of meet those demands. So the wage growth is going to be coming there. It's primarily coming in the leisure and hospitality sector at this point, and it's getting pushed up, kind of trickling through to other sectors. But I do think a lot of the population that we've lost out of the labor force in that 25%, it's going to take many other factors beyond wages to potentially bring them back into the labor force and into employment.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Jerry Beckman. Early in the presentation, you noted that the population decline in St. Louis City was predicted. Any idea when that was first predicted, and was it viewed as problematic back then? Jerry's with the.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jerry. I think that economists have always understood that one of the dynamics that happens within, particularly in the regional and urban economics, is that when you have this gap in housing stocks. So when you have an area that has an aging housing stock, like we have in the city of St. Louis or many city centers across the Midwest, it just becomes more affordable to build new housing than it does to kind of figure out how to reinvigorate your housing stock. And that's ultimately what's driving the declines in population in cities, in urban areas, in urban centers, and pushing the population growth out to the suburbs, plus advancements in technology from on the commuting side of things. So the decline in the city, in the city of St. Louis is not unique to St. Louis. It's the same thing that you would see in most of the city centers across the country. It works okay if you find ways to backfill the use of that land, particularly with job density. And so what you've seen in many cities across the country is that populations have declined in city centers, but employment has increased. That's where I think we've really struggled, is to how do you keep employment moving up so that the city can remain sustainable on sales tax base or earnings tax in some places when they're losing on the population value, or providing incentives to potentially make it more affordable to kind of keep up the housing stock that we have in the region.
Great. Maybe I'll just follow up on that. I mean, do you think that St. Louis County's loss could possibly be attributed to that as well, with some of the aging stock in St. Louis?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when it's too obvious that I think it's often overlooked. But when you look at every individual's household decision-making process, housing stock choices is really critical in where they decide to live and move. And ultimately that feeds into what those amenities look like in those regions, what the schools look like when they're funded. It kind of spills over. So the housing stock piece is really, it's a quick and easy way to see that play out.
Great. Next question comes from Steve Faust. The current Fed administration wants to invest in manufacturing of critical products to avoid the shortages we are seeing. Do you feel our region is positioned to see some of those jobs come our way?
There are areas in advanced manufacturing that this region has thrived, even in the semiconductor space. So I do think that there's some avenues to see gains there. What's still unclear to me is if it's the domestic manufacturing that's driving the supply chain shortages, or is it what appears in my mind to be more the desire to reduce the inventory costs altogether. and kind of become more lean in our supply chain processes, which makes us so that when we have disruptions, or they spread through the economy more quickly. I think if you look at plastics manufacturing outside of Texas, I mean, we're still having challenges even today. And I mean, from talking to our manufacturing contacts, it seems like they're going to go all the way into potentially into the end of this year and into early next year from a winter storm that happened in February. So the shift to domestic, I think, presents global and political, mitigates those global and political risks. However, I don't know exactly how it's ultimately going to play out in adding growth in the region, because you need to ultimately find a buyer or somebody to cover the cost of these increased inventories if we actually want to build them. Most of what we've seen is just increases in economies of scale in the manufacturing sector. So it's likely that existing manufacturing plants are going to probably just expand further, and that could reduce the diversity in the supply chains, which ultimately could present even greater risks. So supply chain diversity is costly, but if we really want to solve the problem, that's what we need to have. But the economics are not really set up in a way for that even to be desirable for many industry players. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out, and you're almost pushing in the opposite direction of the trends in the industry.
Great. Maybe you mentioned the earnings tax. Do you have a sense of how many other urban cities in the country? I think it's something that we get hung up on a lot here, but frankly, I mean, don't other major cities across the country also have an earnings tax?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about most city centers, and what makes St. Louis unique is kind of the way that our cities are defined. But most, core business districts have more employees than they have residents. It's no different in St. Louis. So St. Louis has roughly about 500,000, 600,000 employees, people who work in the city every day, and about 250,000, 300,000 residents. It's that dynamic that is what leads cities and central business districts to look to earnings taxes or business taxes as a way to fund their public services, because most of their public services are being provided to employees. So that's kind of the dynamic that's going on in this case.
Thank you. Another question, costs are up on many products. You touched on that, right? From the construction materials to food. Do you have a sense of what's going to happen, I think, in the near future for higher costs? I think you touched on it, but if you have any other comments about that, that would be great.
Yeah, so I mean, I think inflation pressures are at the forefront of everybody's mind right now as we're seeing the economy reopen. From our policy standpoint and kind of the analysis of the data, it does seem like most of these cost pressures and price increases are temporary in nature. If I kind of walk through things a little bit, what we're seeing is on the professional services side of things, many firms held off on contractual price increases in December or January where they normally would have had them, because we were still in the midst of the pandemic and they didn't want to lose business. Those prices are now starting to increase after 18 months. But those are usually once a year increases that have just been postponed. So you're seeing that combined with the fact that many retailers, because of lower inventories, have stopped using discounts as a way to move product. So consumers are buying just whatever's on the shelf instead of looking for discounts. So the lack of discounts, renewed contract pricing that normally would have happened on an annual basis that had been postponed for many years, that's kind of coming through right now. But that is expected to kind of come back to normal. And then on the auto side of it, that's driving probably about a 5% inflation rate we had in the last month. About 1% of it was due just to used and new auto prices increasing. And that has to do with that semiconductor shortage and then rental fleets kind of reopening. The piece in the kind of the longer term that's going to permeate through is what happens in the leisure and hospitality sector, where we're starting to see price increases come through. And they're facing much higher labor costs as firms are reopening. So if there's a place where we'll see probably more persistent increases going forward, the leisure hospitality sector is one. But in a lot of these other sectors, we expect things to kind of move back to some normal level of increases. And in some cases, like in the case of lumber, for example, it probably is going to revert back down as projects are postponed and the demand kind of starts to subside in those areas. So that's how we ultimately get back to a level of sustainable inflation. However, it is going to take some time, at least through this year and to the end of this year before we start to see that kind of normalize again.
Great, thank you. Since you study, not only St. Louis, but a lot of different areas in the district of the bank, can you touch on, are there any other regions that you would say are best in class that we need to take a second look at? Maybe, through the pandemic or recently?
No, I think every place has its own quirks and benefits. It's one of the things that, and I've talked to other groups about workforce development, and I think this applies greatly, which is we need to understand what works best here, because it's very rare that we can take case studies and research that's been applied in other cities and apply it here. There's just different social dynamics and other barriers that we face that make it really difficult to apply. So I'm always reluctant to say that. However, I would say research specific to St. Louis can be lacking at times, particularly when it comes to understanding labor force dynamics and impact areas. So there is a need to do that work. We're trying to do more of it here at the Fed, but it's also something that we're seeing happening more, and even in our local public sector, and realizing we can't take analysis that was done on Indianapolis and expect the same thing to apply here, because the results just tend to be very different.
Fair enough. And we each have our own assets and liabilities. So I get that. Next question is, what are the big lessons from the pandemic in 5 to 10 years when we kind of look back and talk about 2020? What do you see as the biggest lessons for St. Louis?
I think, one is going to be ultimately the role that the public sector played and the federal government played in providing aid to households in order to get us into a quick recovery and rebound. I know that there's concerns now that maybe it was too much and that it's leading to kind of this stronger reopening than we would have expected. However, I think if we went back to last April, absent the changes that we had, we could have easily found ourselves in another Great Depression. So I think looking back at those programs, understanding what worked and how they worked is going to be really some of the key things that we've learned. One of the downsides to it is we've also realized that some of the programs that we put into place didn't work the way that they were supposed to, and there were disproportionate effects. So for example, payroll protection loans were very difficult for people who didn't have established banking relationships for those businesses to get a hold of. Our unemployment insurance infrastructure was completely overwhelmed in many states. And so people, waited weeks to months before they were able to get pay after being laid off. So those are places where, like, while things worked in the aggregate the way that we wanted them to, there were shocks in certain areas that need to be evaluated. But where we stand today, I think you're going to see that the U.S. economy has fared very well. The death toll obviously is disappointing, and the pandemic hurt many families, but from an economic standpoint, I think we're finding ourselves in a much better place than I think anybody would have expected a year ago. So I think that comes to a testament to the programs that have been put into place and how we've been able to manage it in different areas again, right? I mean, very similar outcomes, but local policies are also very different too.
Great, thank you. That was great. All right, next question. We can't go through a program without talking about crime. It is, I think, something, if you travel, then you're going to see that there's crime everywhere. But the question is, how does the high crime rate in the city of St. Louis impact the economic growth of our region?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. So I've answered it many times, and I try to answer it the same way every time. But what most research finds when it comes to crime in areas, particularly like property crime and street crime that actually impacts, people's day-to-day lives, is the first and foremost thing that happens is within the region, you see migration of the highest income and highest educated households out of areas that are affected by crime. So to the extent that this is happening in St. Louis, and now I'm not talking about murders here, I'm talking mostly about like car break-ins and theft and robberies and those kind of things. That has a tendency to leave, push people out of the city. Ultimately, that can, reduce property values as the demand for high quality housing goes down, and that can reduce public funding. For the most part, it doesn't push people outside of the metropolitan area. And it also tends to have crime itself tends to have little impact on inward migration into the region, which is, I think, ultimately what a lot of people, when I talk to them, that seems to be the concern that they have, is that, the crime statistics that we have for the region are high, and that's making it so businesses don't want to locate to this region or households don't want to move here. That's generally not what's found on the aggregate in the research. But again, it could be unique to St. Louis and different, but that takes a very different study. But in the broader sense, it's mostly within region movement of particularly of high income households and all the problems that get associated with that.
Thank you. I'll throw in one more question, maybe just back to the telecommuting and working from home. I mean, we've been reading a lot about people saying that they might quit if they can't work from home. You did bring up that there will be a slight shift in more people working from home, but maybe have you looked at it from a generational standpoint? Because I'm really worried about our younger generation of workers that need to collaborate to learn, right? I mean,
Yeah.
The folks that have been in their careers for decades have their network built, and being alone in their home is not going to affect them. But for a young person, they have decades to build their network. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of research, but I'll share one anecdote here from me and actually why I'm in the office today, which is I have a team of about 15 people right out of college, and every single one of them volunteered to be one of the first people back into the building because they wanted to be here. They didn't like sitting at home in their own apartments and working. So I do think that, I haven't seen a lot of research on it, but in my own experience and in talking to a lot of people that are kind of in their early 20s and entering the labor force, there is a strong desire to get the gains that come from the workforce. So again, it's just my own personal experience. But I also have seen from on the research standpoint that there is a connection between worker engagement and career progression and the desire to kind of move up in a career and what that means for going back into the office. So it's never going to be the same as it was in the past. And, we do have to give more trust to people and utilize the new tools that we have. But it's more about kind of transitioning to the path forward. And those that are disconnected from their employers that maybe would have stayed along with an employer longer, maybe are more likely to leave, but that can lead to gains for every organization. So we probably will see more turnover in the next 6 to 12 months or 24 months, just due to the fact that so many people have been disengaged from their employers and working remotely.
Great, thank you. Well, that wraps up all the questions. So we so appreciate your time. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly to close things out.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you very much.
Yep, very informational. Appreciate it, Charles, as always, for coming back. I appreciate that. And thank you, Monica, for agreeing to MC and handle the Q&A. Obviously, thank you to our sponsors. We need you for our training education sponsorships throughout the year. I appreciate that. And our training education committee, they are very dedicated to putting these training education programs on. So appreciate that. Shout out to Shane Jones for spearheading this one. As a reminder, please go to our website for information. There's lots of great information there. If you're interested in joining a committee, please reach out to us. We would like to add as many people who are interested on our committees as possible. So please let me know. Of course, the survey is very critical to us. I know it's just another survey to many, but it's really important to us. You give some feedback on things that you'd like to see in the future, things that we can improve, and then how we did. It's really truly valuable to us. And then I'm going to end on a quote because I keep doing that, and hopefully you guys like it. The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. That's by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Have a great one. Appreciate you. Thanks for joining us. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.